The music stopped the moment Damien Cross raised his hand. Elena stood at the center of the great hall, her white ceremonial dress catching the candlelight, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure the whole pack could hear it. This was supposed to be the happiest night of her life. Instead, she watched the man she loved turn away from her in front of everyone she knew. "I cannot bond with you tonight," Damien said. His voice was calm, controlled, the voice of a king who had already made his decision. "The alliance with the Ashford kingdom requires a different mate." For a moment, Elena could not breathe. She looked around the hall, at the hundreds of faces staring back at her, some in shock, some in pity, a few not even bothering to hide their satisfaction. Near the front, a young woman named Serafina stood in a deep red gown, her expression composed, almost triumphant. "Damien," Elena whispered, stepping forward. "We have been promised to each other since we were children. You told me last month that nothing would change." "Things change," he said, and there was no softness left in his eyes. "A king must think of his kingdom before his heart." The words cut deeper than any blade could. Elena felt the eyes of the entire pack on her, felt the whispers already beginning behind cupped hands. She had given this man everything, her loyalty, her trust, her future. And he had just taken it all away in front of a room full of strangers. She would not cry, not here, not in front of them. "Congratulations," she said, her voice shaking, but steady enough to be heard. "I hope your new alliance brings you everything you deserve." She turned and walked toward the doors of the hall, forcing her spine straight, forcing her steps even, though every part of her wanted to run. Behind her, she heard Damien's father, the old advisor Edmund, murmur something to another elder. She did not stop to hear what it was. Outside, the cold night air hit her like a wave, and only then did the tears come, hot and fast, blurring the stars overhead. She kept walking, past the training grounds, past the stables, until the lights of the pack house disappeared behind the trees. She did not have a plan. She only knew she could not stay another minute in that place. The forest at night was not safe for a lone wolf, especially not one still dressed in ceremonial silk, but Elena did not care. Her chest ached with a pain she had never known before, a pain that made the danger of the woods feel almost welcome. Let something happen to her. Let the world take something from her for once, instead of the other way around. She ran until her lungs burned, until the silver light of the moon was the only thing guiding her path. She did not know how long she had been moving when she first heard the sound behind her, a low growl carried on the wind. She froze. Rogue wolves. She knew the sound too well, the wolves who belonged to no pack, who lived outside the rules that kept the forest in balance. Her father had warned her about them since she was a child. Never travel alone at night. Never trust a howl you do not recognize. She had broken both rules in a single hour. Elena turned, searching the darkness, and saw 3 pairs of eyes glowing between the trees. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She was not dressed for a fight, not prepared for one, not even sure she had the strength left after everything that had happened tonight. But instinct took over, and she began to back away slowly, refusing to show fear, even as her whole body trembled. "Lost, little wolf?" a rough voice called out from the shadows. "Far from home, aren't you?" She did not answer. She kept moving backward, her eyes scanning for any path of escape, any tree she might climb, any direction that might lead her back toward safety. But the strangers were faster than her, circling with the patience of hunters who knew their prey had nowhere left to run. One of them lunged toward her. Elena spun and ran, her dress tearing on branches, her bare feet cut by stones hidden beneath fallen leaves. She could hear them behind her, closing in, and she pushed herself faster than she had ever run in her life. The forest blurred around her, trees rushing past like dark pillars, until her foot caught on a root, and she fell hard onto the ground. Pain shot through her ankle. She tried to rise, but her leg would not hold her weight. The strangers were closer now, their low growls filling the night air, and for the first time since she had left the pack house, Elena understood that she might not survive this. She thought of her mother's voice, of the songs she used to sing when Elena was small. She thought of the promises Damien had once made her, under a different moon, promises that meant nothing now. She thought, strangely, that if this was how her story ended, at least the pain in her chest would finally stop. A sudden shape crashed through the trees behind her. and the strangers scattered with startled yelps. Elena tried to turn, to see what had frightened them, but her vision was already going dark at the edges. The last thing she saw before consciousness slipped away was a pair of sharp eyes the color of storm clouds, watching her from a distance, unreadable and calm. Then there was nothing but darkness. When Elena woke, she was no longer in the forest. She was lying on something soft, a bed with sheets finer than any she had felt before, in a room she did not recognize. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, and for a moment she thought she might be dreaming, that none of the previous night had actually happened. Then the pain in her ankle reminded her that it had. She sat up slowly, wincing, and looked around the unfamiliar room. The walls were made of dark stone, unlike the warm wood of her own pack house. Everything here felt older, heavier, built to withstand more than time. A quiet knock sounded at the door before it opened, and a young woman entered carrying a tray of food and water. "You're awake," the woman said, setting the tray down gently. "That's good. We were not sure you would survive the night, with how badly you were hurt." "Where am I?" Elena asked, her voice hoarse. The woman hesitated, glancing toward the door as though checking whether someone might overhear. "You are in Thornwood territory," she said finally. "King Roderick's scouts found you in the forest. They brought you here." Elena's stomach dropped. Thornwood. The name alone was enough to make her pulse quicken with worry. Every member of Blackthorn had grown up hearing stories about the Thornwood kingdom, about their fierce king and his fearsome reputation, about the old rivalry between the two territories that stretched back generations. Blackthorn and Thornwood had not been at peace in living memory. "Why would your king help me?" Elena asked carefully. "I am from Blackthorn." "I don't know his reasons," the woman admitted. "I only know he gave orders that you were to be cared for, not turned away. My name is Claire. I have been asked to look after you until you are strong enough to move on your own." Elena looked down at her bandaged ankle, then at her torn and dirty ceremonial dress, still stained with dried blood and forest dirt. Everything about last night felt like it belonged to another life, a life she had walked away from in the space of a single humiliating moment. And now she was here, in enemy territory, alive only because of the mercy of a man her own pack had taught her to fear. "Does your king know who I am?" she asked quietly. "Does he know I was meant to bond with Alpha Damien?" Claire's expression flickered with something Elena could not quite read. "He knows," she said. "Word travels fast between kingdoms, even ones that do not speak to each other often. I imagine he will want to speak with you himself, once you are able to stand." Elena felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the cool morning air. She did not know what to expect from the rival king, whether he intended to use her as a prisoner, a bargaining piece, or something else entirely. But one thing was certain: the life she had known, the life built around loving a man who had cast her aside in front of everyone she trusted, was already gone. Whatever came next, she would have to face it as someone new. Claire helped her eat a small meal, though Elena had little appetite, her mind still spinning with everything that had happened. As the hours passed, she drifted in and out of an uneasy sleep, her dreams filled with the sound of Damien's voice announcing her rejection, over and over, the hall full of faces watching her fall apart. When she woke again, the light outside had shifted to the deep orange of late afternoon, and there was a presence in the room that had not been there before. A tall figure stood near the window, his back to her, dressed simply in dark clothing that seemed to absorb the fading sunlight. Even without seeing his face, Elena could feel the quiet authority radiating from him, the kind of presence that filled a room without effort. He turned slowly, and Elena found herself looking into the same storm-gray eyes she remembered from the forest, the ones that had watched her before darkness took her. "You're finally awake," he said. His voice was low, measured, nothing like the sharp command Damien used when he spoke to his pack. "I was beginning to think my scouts had wasted their time." Elena straightened against the pillows, trying to hide how unsteady she felt. "You're King Roderick," she said. It was not a question. "I am," he replied, stepping closer, his gaze studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, though something in her refused to. "And you are Elena of Blackthorn. The woman your Alpha King humiliated in front of his entire court, only hours before wandering wolves nearly finished what he started." The bluntness of his words stung, but Elena refused to let it show. "Is that why you helped me?" she asked. "Because it makes Damien look weak?" Something shifted in Roderick's expression, not quite a smile, but close enough that it changed the entire mood of the room. Perhaps, he admitted, or perhaps I simply do not enjoy watching wolves suffer when I have the power to stop it. Does it matter which reason is true? Elena did not have an answer for that. She studied him carefully, searching for the coldness her own pack had always insisted lived behind Thornwood eyes, but she found only calm calculation, the look of a man who weighed every word before he spoke it. "What happens to me now?" she asked finally. Roderick considered the question for a long moment. "That depends on what you want," he said. "You can heal here, under my protection, for as long as you need. When you are strong enough, you may return to your pack, if that is still your wish, or you may choose to stay. The choice will be yours, not mine." It was not the answer she expected. She had braced herself for threats, for demands, for the kind of coldness her people had always described when speaking of Thornwood's king. Instead, she found herself facing something far more unsettling: kindness from the one man she had been raised to fear. "Why would you offer me that?" she asked quietly. Roderick's gaze held hers, steady and unreadable. "Because everyone in that hall last night saw a broken woman," he said. "I do not think that is who you truly are." He turned to leave, pausing only briefly at the door. "Rest, Elena of Blackthorn. Tomorrow, we will speak again." The door closed softly behind him, leaving Elena alone with her thoughts, her heart still racing from an encounter she did not fully understand. Somewhere beyond these walls, in a kingdom she once called home, Damien was likely celebrating his new alliance, believing she had disappeared into the forest to nurse her wounds alone. He had no idea she was alive. He had no idea where she was. And for the first time since the humiliation of that hall, Elena felt something other than grief rising inside her chest. She felt the first spark of something new, something that, in time, would grow into a fire strong enough to change everything. 3 days passed before Elena could stand without help, and in that time, she learned more about Thornwood than she had ever known from the stories told back home. The kingdom was not the shadowed, cruel place her people described. The halls were quiet, but not cold. The wolves who passed her in the corridors nodded politely, some even offering small smiles, as though a woman from Blackthorn were nothing unusual to fear. Claire visited her often, bringing meals and news, and slowly a fragile friendship began to form between them. It was Claire who told her, on the 4th morning, that word of her disappearance had finally reached her old pack. "They searched the forest for 2 days, Claire said, setting a cup of warm tea on the table beside the bed. Then they stopped. Some say Alpha Damien ordered the search ended himself." Elena's hands tightened around the blanket in her lap. "He stopped looking for me?" "That's what the scouts heard," Claire said gently. "I'm sorry. I know that isn't easy to hear. It shouldn't have hurt as much as it did." Elena told herself this over and over, as she stared out the window at the unfamiliar trees of Thornwood territory. She had already accepted that Damien had chosen someone else. She had already accepted that their bond, the one she had built her entire future around, was broken beyond repair. And yet some small, foolish part of her had hoped he would at least come looking, if only out of guilt. He hadn't, and now she understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water, that she truly had no one left from her old life, no pack, no mate, no home to return to, even if she wanted one. "What will happen to me if I stay here?" Elena asked quietly. Claire considered the question carefully. "King Roderick does not make promises he doesn't intend to keep," she said. "If he told you the choice was yours, then it is yours. He isn't like the stories say." "And what do the stories say?" Claire's expression turned thoughtful. "That he is cold, that he cares for nothing but his kingdom's strength, that he has never once shown mercy to an enemy." She paused, glancing toward the door as though making sure they were alone. "But I have served in this house for 3 years, and I have never seen him act with more care than he has shown you. Make of that what you will." Elena did not know what to make of it. Every instinct told her to be cautious, to remember that Roderick was still the king of a kingdom that had opposed her own for generations. But every quiet act of kindness she witnessed in this place chipped away at the fear she had carried with her since childhood. That afternoon, Roderick returned to her room, as he had promised. This time he did not stand distant by the window but pulled a chair close to her bed and sat, studying her with the same careful attention he had shown before. Your ankle is healing well, he observed, glancing at the fresh bandages Claire had applied that morning. Another week, and you should be able to walk without pain. Thank you, Elena said, for everything you have done. I know I have no right to ask for your kindness, given who I am and where I come from. You have every right, Roderick said simply. Kindness should not depend on the name of someone's pack. Elena studied him carefully, trying to understand the man sitting before her. Why did you really save me that night? You could have let the wandering wolves finish what they started. It would have solved a problem for you. One less tie between my pack and yours to worry about. Roderick's gaze did not waver. I have fought in enough conflicts to know the difference between an enemy and an innocent caught between one, he said. You were never my enemy, Elena. You were a woman betrayed by a man who did not deserve you, running through a forest that should never have been unsafe for her. That is all I saw. The simplicity of his answer unsettled her more than any grand explanation could have. She had expected calculation, some hidden plan behind his mercy. Instead, she found only honesty, delivered without hesitation or apology. I don't know what to do now, Elena admitted, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Everything I built my life around is gone. My pack, my future, even my name means something different now. I am no longer Elena, the future queen of Blackthorn. I am just Elena, the woman who was left behind. Then perhaps it is time to build something new, Roderick said. You are not the first wolf to lose everything and find a different path forward. You will not be the last. Easy words for a king with a kingdom already built beneath him, Elena said, though there was no bitterness in her voice, only a tired honesty. A faint smile crossed Roderick's face, the first genuine one she had seen from him. Perhaps, he admitted, but even kings start somewhere. I was not born wearing this crown, Elena. I fought for every piece of the kingdom I now protect. Over the following days, their conversations became a quiet ritual. Roderick would visit in the late afternoon, and they would speak of small things at first, the history of Thornwood, the customs that differed from Blackthorn, the mountains visible from the northern towers. Slowly, the conversations deepened, and Elena found herself sharing pieces of her past she had never spoken aloud to anyone, not even to Damien during all their years together. She told him about her mother, who had died when Elena was young, leaving her to be raised by a father who buried himself in duty rather than grief. She told him about growing up in the shadow of an arranged future, promised to Damien before she was old enough to understand what that promise truly meant. She told him about the years of preparing herself to be his queen, learning everything a future alpha's mate needed to know, only to have it all discarded in a single evening. Roderick listened without interrupting, without offering the empty comfort she had grown used to receiving from others. When he did speak, his words carried a weight that made her feel, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that someone was truly listening. You spent your whole life becoming someone else's queen, he said one evening, as the sun set behind the mountains outside her window. Perhaps it is time you considered what it would mean to become your own. The words settled into her chest like a seed, quiet but persistent, taking root in a place she had not realized was empty. She did not have an answer for him that night, but she found herself thinking about his words long after he had left the room. Meanwhile, far beyond the borders of Thornwood, life inside Blackthorn had not remained still. Damien's bond with Serafina had been finalized within days of Elena's disappearance, sealed with the political alliance her family had promised in exchange. On the surface, the arrangement appeared to be everything Damien had claimed it would be, strengthening his kingdom's standing among the northern territories. But beneath the surface, something had shifted in him that he could not explain, even to himself. He found himself distracted during council meetings, his mind wandering to memories of Elena's laughter, to the years they had spent building a future he had thrown away in a single decision. He told himself it was simply the weight of new responsibilities, the pressure of managing an unfamiliar alliance. He told himself many things, none of which eased the strange hollow feeling that had settled into his chest since the night of the ceremony. Serafina noticed his distraction more than anyone. She was not a foolish woman, and she understood quickly that her new mate's heart had not fully arrived in their bond, even if his duty had. She said nothing of it directly, but her patience wore thinner with each passing week, each distant look Damien gave when he thought no one was watching. You think of her still, Serafina said one evening, breaking the silence between them as they sat in the private quarters of the pack house. It was not a question. Damien did not deny it. She is a part of my past that I am still learning to let go of, he said carefully. It will take time. Time, Serafina repeated, her voice cool. And what happens if she returns one day? Will your time run out before then, or after? Damien had no answer for her. The truth was, he did not know what he would feel if Elena walked back through the doors of Blackthorn. He told himself he would feel nothing but the awkward discomfort of facing someone he had wronged. But some nights, lying awake beside a mate he had chosen for duty rather than love, he wondered if that was truly the whole truth. Word had reached him, through the usual channels of gossip that traveled between neighboring territories, that the search for Elena had ended without success. His scouts had found signs of a struggle in the forest, torn fabric matching her ceremonial dress, but no trace of her beyond that point. Most assumed the worst. Damien told himself he believed it too. But something in him refused to accept it fully, a stubborn instinct that whispered she was still out there somewhere, alive, waiting for a reason to be found. He did not act on that instinct. His pride would not allow it, not after the way he had ended things between them, not with a new mate now bonded beside him, and an alliance depending on his loyalty to her. So he buried the feeling, as he had buried so many others, and continued forward with the life he had chosen, even as a quiet unease continued to grow in the space where his certainty used to live. Back in Thornwood, Elena's strength continued to return, and with it came a change in how she carried herself. The broken woman who had stumbled into enemy territory, wounded and hopeless, was slowly giving way to someone steadier, someone who watched the world with clearer eyes. One morning, Roderick found her standing at the window of her room, without assistance for the first time, her weight balanced carefully on her healing ankle, her gaze fixed on the training grounds below, where Thornwood warriors practiced their forms in the early light. "You're standing," he observed, a note of approval in his voice. "I am tired of being someone who needs to be carried through her own life," Elena said, not turning from the window. "I want to learn to stand on my own, in every sense of the word." Roderick joined her at the window, watching the warriors below in comfortable silence for a long moment before speaking. "That can be arranged," he said finally, "if it is truly what you want." Elena turned to face him, something new settling in her expression, a determination that had not been there when she first arrived. "It is," she said. "I want to learn to fight. I want to learn to protect myself, so that I never again have to depend on someone else's mercy to survive." A faint light flickered in Roderick's storm-gray eyes, something that looked almost like respect. "Then we will begin tomorrow," he said. "But I warn you, Elena of Blackthorn, once you start down this path, there is no easy way back to the life you left behind." Elena looked out at the training grounds once more, at the warriors moving with practiced strength and purpose, and felt something settle firmly into place inside her chest. "Good," she said quietly. "I never want to go back to that life again." The training grounds of Thornwood were nothing like anything Elena had experienced in Blackthorn, where her old pack had trained its women in graceful movements meant for ceremony and diplomacy. Thornwood trained everyone, regardless of position, to be capable of defending themselves and each other. On her first morning, Elena arrived to find a wide stone courtyard, surrounded by tall walls, already filled with the sounds of warriors sparring under the pale early light. A woman named Amelia approached her first, dressed in simple training clothes, her dark hair tied back tightly. "You must be the one King Roderick asked me to work with," she said, studying Elena with open curiosity. "I hear you want to learn to fight." "I do," Elena said, straightening despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. Amelia smiled, though there was nothing unkind in it. "Good. Most people who come from soft lives think fighting is about strength alone. It isn't. It's about patience, timing, and knowing your own body better than your opponent knows theirs. We'll start slow." The first weeks were harder than Elena had imagined. Her body, trained for years in the elegant movements expected of a future queen, resisted the sharp, practical motions Amelia tried to teach her. She fell more times than she could count, bruised her arms blocking strikes she didn't see coming, and collapsed exhausted onto her bed each evening, with muscles she never knew she had aching in protest. But she did not quit. Something had shifted inside her since that night in the forest, since the moment she understood that no one was coming to save her. that she alone was responsible for what happened next in her life. That understanding had planted a stubbornness in her that refused to let failure be the end of her story. Roderick watched her progress from a distance most days, rarely interrupting her lessons directly, though Elena often felt his presence at the edge of the training grounds, a quiet observer taking note of her growth. Occasionally, when Amelia was called away for other duties, he would step in himself, correcting her stance with careful, precise instructions, his patience seemingly endless, even when her frustration was not. "You are trying too hard to fight like someone else," he told her one afternoon, after she had failed for the 5th time to land a clean strike against him during a practice bout. "You keep copying the movements Amelia taught you, but your body does not move the same way hers does. Find your own rhythm." "That's easy for you to say," Elena said, breathing hard, sweat dampening the collar of her training clothes. "You've been fighting your entire life." "I have," Roderick agreed. "And I fell just as many times as you have, when I was learning. The difference is, no one was watching me fail, so I never felt embarrassed enough to quit." Elena wiped her forehead and looked at him, something in his words settling the frustration in her chest. "You're saying I should stop caring what anyone thinks." "I'm saying the only person whose opinion should matter in this yard is your own," he said. "Now, again. This time, trust your own instincts, not mine or Amelia's." She squared her shoulders and reset her stance, focusing not on mimicking the movements she had been taught, but on how her own body wanted to respond to the space between them. When Roderick moved to strike, she shifted instinctively, deflecting the blow with a motion that felt entirely her own, and for the first time since her training began, she landed a solid counter that made him step back in genuine surprise. "Better," he said, a note of real approval in his voice. "Much better." The victory, small as it was, filled Elena with a satisfaction she had never felt during all her years of ceremonial training back in Blackthorn. There, she had been praised for grace, for obedience, for fitting neatly into the role expected of her. Here, she was being praised for something entirely her own, something no one had given her, and no one could take away. As the weeks passed, her body grew stronger, leaner, more capable, and her confidence grew alongside it. She no longer flinched at sparring bouts, no longer doubted her ability to hold her ground against opponents twice her size. The change was not lost on the other members of Thornwood, who began greeting her with genuine respect, rather than the cautious curiosity she had first received as an outsider from enemy territory. Claire noticed the shift most of all. "You walk differently now," she observed one evening, as they sat together sharing a simple meal in Elena's quarters. "When you first arrived, you moved like someone trying to take up as little space as possible. Now you walk like you belong, wherever you stand." "I feel different," Elena admitted, surprised by how true the words felt as she spoke them. "I used to think my worth depended on someone else choosing me. Now I think I was wrong about that. For most of my life." Claire smiled warmly. "King Roderick has that effect on people," she said. "He never tells anyone who to be. He simply gives them room to figure it out themselves." Elena thought about those words long after Claire had left for the evening. Over the months since her arrival, her feelings toward Roderick had shifted in ways she had not fully allowed herself to examine. What had begun as cautious gratitude had grown into something warmer, something that made her chest tighten pleasantly whenever he entered a room, something that made their quiet evening conversations the part of her day she looked forward to most. She told herself it was simply friendship, born from circumstance and shared time, but some nights, lying awake in the quiet of her borrowed room, she wondered if it was becoming something more, something she was not yet ready to name. The test of her training came sooner than anyone expected. Late one evening, nearly 5 months after her arrival in Thornwood, alarm horns sounded across the territory, calling every able warrior to the eastern border. A group of wandering wolves, larger and better organized than the ones who had attacked Elena in the forest, had crossed into Thornwood land, threatening a small settlement of farmers who lived near the border. Elena did not hesitate. She grabbed the training blade Amelia had gifted her weeks earlier, and joined the warriors gathering in the courtyard, ignoring the surprised glances from those who still remembered her as the wounded outsider, brought in on a stretcher months before. Roderick found her among the gathered fighters, his expression unreadable in the torchlight. "This is not a training exercise, Elena," he said quietly, stepping close enough that only she could hear him. "This is real danger. You do not have to prove anything by joining us." "I'm not trying to prove anything," Elena said, meeting his gaze steadily. "I want to help protect the people who took me in when I had nothing. Let me do that." For a long moment, Roderick studied her, weighing something behind his storm-gray eyes. Finally, he gave a single, decisive nod. "Stay close to Amelia," he said, "and trust your training." The journey to the eastern border passed in tense silence, the warriors moving swiftly through the darkened forest, every sense alert for signs of danger. When they arrived, the settlement was already in chaos, terrified families gathering their children, while a handful of local guards struggled to hold back the advancing wolves. The fight that followed was unlike anything Elena had experienced in the safety of the training courtyard. Real danger moved differently than practiced bouts, faster and less predictable, every instinct screaming at her to freeze, even as her training pushed her body forward into motion. She fought alongside Amelia, protecting a group of frightened children as they were herded toward safety, using every lesson she had learned in the months since her arrival. At one point, a wandering wolf broke through the line of defenders and lunged directly toward her, and for a heartbeat, the old fear from that first terrifying night in the forest threatened to freeze her in place. But she remembered Roderick's words, about trusting her own instincts, about finding her own rhythm rather than copying someone else's fear. She moved, deflecting the attack with a precision that surprised even herself, driving the threat back long enough for reinforcements to arrive. By the time the sun began to rise over the eastern border, the wandering wolves had been driven back beyond Thornwood territory, the settlement saved with only minor injuries among the defenders. Elena stood amid the aftermath, her whole body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline, but alive, whole, and for the first time in her life, genuinely proud of what her own strength had accomplished. Roderick found her as the warriors began their return journey, his expression a complicated mixture of relief and something else she could not quite name. "You fought well," he said simply. "I was terrified," Elena admitted. "Good," Roderick said. "Only fools feel no fear in battle. What matters is that you moved forward despite it." He paused, studying her for a long moment. "Your father would be proud, if he could see you now." The mention of her father, the man who had raised her but never truly seen her, sent an unexpected wave of emotion through Elena's chest. "I don't know if that's true," she said quietly. "He always wanted me to be a queen who ruled through grace and diplomacy. This isn't the life he imagined for me." "Perhaps not," Roderick said, "but it might be the life that makes you whole." He held her gaze a moment longer than necessary, before turning to address the rest of the returning warriors, leaving Elena standing there, with her heart racing, for reasons that had nothing to do with the battle they had just survived. By the time they returned to the pack house, word of the settlement's defense had already begun spreading through Thornwood territory, and Elena's name was spoken among the warriors with a respect she had never known in her old life. She was no longer simply the outsider from Blackthorn who had been taken in out of mercy. She was becoming something new entirely, a woman forging her own place in a kingdom that had never asked her to be anyone but herself. That night, exhausted but unable to sleep, Elena stood once again at the window of her room, looking out over the quiet grounds of Thornwood territory bathed in moonlight. She thought of the woman who had fled through the forest months earlier, broken and hopeless, believing her life had ended the moment Damien turned away from her. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone from a story she had once read, rather than a life she had actually lived. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who had learned that worth was not something given by another person's choice, but something built through struggle, through failure, through the slow and difficult work of becoming. She did not yet know what the future held, whether her path would lead her back toward the kingdom she had left behind, or forward into something entirely new. But for the first time since that terrible night in the Great Hall, Elena felt something steady beneath her feet. She felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. News of the battle at Thornwood's eastern border did not stay contained within its own territory for long. Traveling merchants carried the story along trade routes, embellishing it with each retelling, until whispers of a woman from Blackthorn fighting alongside Thornwood warriors reached ears far beyond where anyone expected. It was Edmund, Damien's aging advisor, who first brought the rumor to the Alpha King's attention. He found Damien alone in his study, reviewing reports from the Northern Territories, and hesitated at the doorway before speaking. "There is something you should hear," Edmund said carefully. "A rumor traveling with the merchants from the eastern trade roads." Damien looked up, sensing something unusual in the old advisor's tone. "Go on." "They speak of a battle at Thornwood's border, several months past," Edmund said. "A settlement of farmers, attacked by wandering wolves. The Thornwood warriors drove them back, but the merchants say something unusual happened during the fight. They say a woman fought among them, a woman they claim came originally from Blackthorn." Damien's hand went still on the papers before him. "That's impossible," he said, though something in his chest had already begun to tighten. "Elena is dead. My scouts found signs of an attack in the forest months ago. There was no trace of her beyond that point." "No trace of her body either," Edmund pointed out gently. "Only torn fabric and disturbed ground. We assumed the worst, but we never confirmed it." Damien rose from his chair, pacing toward the window of his study, his mind spinning through possibilities he had spent months refusing to consider. If Elena had survived that night, if she had somehow found her way into enemy territory and lived there long enough to fight alongside their warriors, it would mean everything he had believed about her fate was wrong. It would also mean she had chosen to stay in Thornwood rather than return home. "Find out if this rumor is true," Damien said finally, his voice tight with an emotion he could not fully name. Quietly, "I do not want Serafina to hear of this, until I understand what we are truly dealing with." Edmund nodded and left to carry out the order, leaving Damien alone with a storm of feelings he had spent months trying to bury. If Elena was alive, if she had survived and found safety, even in enemy territory, then some part of the guilt that had haunted him since that terrible night in the Great Hall might finally ease. But another part of him, one he was reluctant to examine too closely, felt something sharper than guilt at the thought of her building a new life among the warriors of Thornwood. He told himself it was simply concern for her safety, nothing more. He told himself many things in the days that followed, none of which fully convinced even himself. It took nearly 2 weeks for Edmund's inquiries to yield confirmation. He returned to Damien's study late one evening, his expression grave. "The rumors are true," Edmund said without preamble. "Elena is alive. She has been living in Thornwood territory since the night she disappeared, under the direct protection of King Roderick himself." The words landed like a physical blow. Damien sat frozen for a long moment, processing the implications of what he had just heard. "King Roderick personally protects her?" he repeated. "Why would he do that? What could he possibly gain from sheltering a woman from Blackthorn?" "I don't know his reasons," Edmund admitted. "But the merchants speak of more than simple shelter. They say she has become skilled in combat, trained alongside Thornwood's own warriors. Some even suggest a closer bond has formed between her and the king himself, though such rumors should be treated with caution until confirmed." A closer bond. The words settled into Damien's chest with a weight he had not expected, an ache that felt uncomfortably close to jealousy, though he refused to name it as such even in the privacy of his own thoughts. "Thank you, Edmund," Damien said quietly. "You may go." Once alone, Damien found himself unable to focus on the reports awaiting his attention, his mind circling instead around the image of Elena thriving in enemy territory, learning to fight, building a life alongside a king known throughout the Northern Territories for his fierce reputation. He tried to tell himself it did not matter, that his life had moved forward with Serafina, that whatever Elena chose to do with her new circumstances was no longer his concern. But the hollow feeling that had settled into his chest since the night of the ceremony only grew heavier with each passing day, and he found himself increasingly unable to ignore it. Serafina noticed the change in her mate almost immediately, though it took her several days to uncover its cause. She was not a woman easily fooled, and Damien's distraction, combined with Edmund's sudden secretive visits to the study, told her clearly enough that something significant had occurred. She confronted him directly one evening, finding him alone on the balcony overlooking the training grounds, his gaze distant and unfocused on the warriors practicing below. "You've heard something about her," Serafina said, not bothering to soften the accusation. "The rejected woman, Elena." Damien did not deny it, understanding that pretense would only deepen the growing distance between them. "She's alive," he said quietly. "She's been living in Thornwood territory since the night she disappeared." Serafina absorbed this information with a stillness that was more unsettling than any outburst might have been.
"And this troubles you," she observed. "More than it should, for a man who claimed his heart had already moved forward."
"It troubles me because I sent her into that forest with nowhere to go," Damien said, though even as he spoke the words, he could hear how incomplete they sounded. "Guilt is not the same as regret over our bond, Serafina. Isn't it?" Serafina asked, her voice carrying an edge that had not been there before. "I have shared your bed for months, Damien. I have watched you stare into distances that have nothing to do with the kingdom we are meant to be building together. I think you know as well as I do what this feeling truly is, even if you refuse to name it." Damien had no answer for her, and his silence spoke louder than any denial could have. Serafina studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before turning and walking back into the pack house without another word, leaving him alone with the weight of a truth he was not yet ready to face. In the weeks that followed, the alliance between Damien and Serafina's kingdom continued on the surface, trade agreements honored, diplomatic visits exchanged, the appearance of unity carefully maintained for the benefit of both territories. But beneath that surface, something had begun to crack, a fracture that widened with each passing week, as Damien's thoughts continued to drift toward the woman he had cast aside, and the enemy kingdom that had welcomed her, when his own had failed to protect her. He told himself repeatedly that his feelings were nothing more than guilt, that any decent alpha would feel troubled learning that someone he had wronged now lived among his kingdom's fiercest rivals. But late at night, lying awake beside a mate who increasingly kept her distance, he found himself imagining Elena's new life in vivid detail, wondering what she looked like now, wondering if the gentle woman he had known had truly transformed into a warrior capable of standing against wandering wolves in battle. He wondered, though he refused to voice the thought even to himself, what it would feel like to see her again. Far away in Thornwood territory, Elena remained entirely unaware of the storm her survival had stirred within the walls of her old kingdom. Her days had settled into a rhythm she had grown to treasure, filled with training in the mornings, quiet conversations with Roderick in the evenings, and a steadily growing sense of belonging within a community that had never known her as anything other than the strong woman she was becoming. She thought of Blackthorn less and less as the months passed, the pain of that humiliating night in the Great Hall fading into something more distant, more manageable, a memory that no longer had the power to bring her to her knees. She had built something new in its place, something entirely her own, and she found that she did not miss the life she had left behind nearly as much as she had once feared she would. But somewhere, beyond the borders of the kingdom that had become her home, the man who had once broken her heart was beginning to understand that the choice he had made on that terrible night might not have been the ending he believed it to be. It was, in truth, only the beginning of a much larger reckoning still to come. Winter arrived early in Thornwood territory that year, blanketing the mountains in a thick layer of snow that transformed the training grounds into a quieter, gentler place than the one Elena had grown accustomed to. Sparring sessions moved indoors to the Great Hall, and evenings grew longer, filled with fires crackling in stone hearths and conversations that stretched deep into the night. Elena had changed significantly in the months since her arrival, both in body and in spirit. Her once delicate hands now carried the calluses of a warrior. Her posture, once trained for ceremony and grace, now carried the confident readiness of someone who had learned to trust her own strength. But it was the change in her eyes that Claire noticed most, a steadiness that had not been there during those first difficult weeks of recovery. "You seem different tonight," Claire observed, as they sat together near the fire in Elena's quarters, sharing warm drinks against the winter chill. "Lighter, somehow." Elena smiled, considering the observation. "I think I finally stopped waiting," she said. "For months, some part of me kept expecting to wake up and find myself back in Blackthorn, as though this life were only a temporary detour before returning to what I was supposed to become. I don't feel that way anymore." "What changed?" Claire asked. Elena thought about the question carefully before answering. "I think I finally understood that I get to decide what I'm supposed to become," she said. "No one else gets to make that choice for me anymore." Claire's smile widened. "King Roderick will be glad to hear that," she said, a teasing note entering her voice. "Though I suspect his gladness has less to do with your personal growth, and more to do with how much time he has spent seeking your company these past months." Elena felt warmth rise to her cheeks, though she tried to keep her expression neutral. We are friends, she said. He has shown me great kindness. Friends, Claire repeated, clearly unconvinced. Elena, the entire pack has noticed how he watches you during training, how he finds reasons to visit your quarters each evening, even when there is no urgent matter requiring his attention. I have served this king for 3 years, and I have never seen him give anyone the attention he gives you. Elena did not know how to respond to that. Though her heart had already begun to race at the suggestion, she had allowed herself to acknowledge, in the privacy of her own thoughts, that her feelings toward Roderick had grown into something far beyond simple gratitude. But she had not permitted herself to hope that those feelings might be returned, not after everything she had lost believing in a love that had ultimately betrayed her. Even if that were true, Elena said carefully, I don't know if I'm ready to trust those kinds of feelings again. Not after everything that happened with Damien. Claire's expression softened with understanding. King Roderick is not Alpha Damien, she said gently. He has never once broken a promise made to this pack. Not in all the years I have known him. Whatever he offers you, Elena, you can trust it will be genuine. The conversation stayed with Elena long after Claire had left for the evening, and she found herself unable to sleep, her thoughts circling around months of quiet evenings spent with Roderick, conversations that had grown steadily more personal, moments of connection she had told herself were simply the natural result of shared circumstance. She thought of the way his expression changed when she entered a room, softening in a manner she had noticed but refused to examine too closely. She thought of the careful patience he had shown during her training, the genuine pride in his voice when she succeeded, the quiet concern he had never quite hidden during that dangerous night at the eastern border. Perhaps Claire was right. Perhaps there was more between them than simple friendship, something that had been growing steadily since that first conversation in her recovery room, something she had been too afraid to name. The following evening, Roderick visited her quarters, as he had grown accustomed to doing, carrying with him reports from the northern trade routes that he often reviewed while they talked. But tonight, something felt different in his manner, a hesitation she had not noticed before, as though he too were carrying thoughts he had not yet found the courage to voice. You seem distracted, Elena observed, watching him stare unseeing at the papers in his hands. Roderick set the reports aside, meeting her gaze directly. I have been thinking about something for some time, he admitted. I am not entirely certain how to raise it without overstepping boundaries. I have tried carefully to respect. Elena's heart began to race, though she kept her voice steady. You can speak freely with me, Roderick. You always have. He was quiet for a long moment, studying her, with an intensity that made her breath catch in her chest. When you first arrived here, he said slowly, I told myself my only responsibility was to see you healed and safe, nothing more. I did not expect to find myself looking forward to our conversations more than any other part of my day. I did not expect to find myself proud of your progress, in ways that go beyond simple concern for a guest under my protection. Elena's pulse quickened further, hardly daring to hope she understood his meaning correctly. Roderick, she said softly. I am not asking you to answer tonight, he continued, his voice carrying a vulnerability she had never heard from him before. I know what you lost, and I know how carefully you have had to rebuild yourself since that loss. I would never ask you to offer feelings you are not ready to give. But I wanted you to know, Elena, that whatever you decide about your future, about whether to remain in Thornwood or return to the life you left behind, my feelings for you are genuine. They have grown into something I no longer wish to hide. The room fell silent, filled only with the crackling of the fire and the sound of Elena's own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She studied the man before her, the king who had shown her nothing but honesty and patience since the night he found her broken and bleeding in the forest, the man who had never once asked anything of her beyond her own willingness to heal and grow at her own pace. I think, Elena said slowly, choosing her words with care, that I have been afraid to admit my own feelings, because admitting them meant risking the same kind of pain I felt that night in the Great Hall. But you are not Damien, Roderick. You have never given me reason to doubt your honesty, not once, in all the months I have known you. She reached out, her hand finding his across the small distance between them, and felt something settle into place inside her chest. A certainty she had not expected to feel again, after everything that had happened. I care for you, she said, the words feeling both terrifying and true as she spoke them. More deeply than I have allowed myself to acknowledge, until tonight. Roderick's hand closed gently around hers, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of months of careful restraint finally giving way to something honest and unguarded between them. "I would never ask you to rush this," Roderick said finally, "but I wanted you to know where I stand, Elena, without hidden intentions or unspoken expectations. Whatever comes next, I want it to be a choice you make freely, not one shaped by gratitude or circumstance." "I understand," Elena said, and found that she meant it fully. For the first time since that terrible night in Blackthorn's great hall, she felt herself standing on solid ground, choosing a path forward, not out of desperation or fear, but out of genuine desire for the future, taking shape before her. The weeks that followed brought a new tenderness to their relationship. Evenings spent not simply in conversation, but in quiet companionship that required no words at all. Moments of connection that grew steadily deeper as winter gave way to the first signs of spring returning to the mountains. Elena's training continued alongside this new closeness, her skills sharpening further under Amelia's guidance, her confidence growing with each passing week, until she moved through the training grounds with the easy authority of someone who had truly earned her place among Thornwood's warriors. The pack that had once viewed her with cautious curiosity now regarded her with genuine respect, some even beginning to whisper of a future where she might stand beside their king, not simply as a companion, but as something far more significant. Those whispers reached Elena eventually, carried by Claire during one of their regular evening visits. "The pack speaks of you as though your future here is already decided," Claire said, a teasing smile on her face. "They say King Roderick has never looked at anyone the way he looks at you." Elena felt warmth rise in her cheeks, though she no longer tried to hide it as she once might have. "The future is still uncertain," she said, though her heart already knew where her own hopes had settled. "But I no longer fear whatever comes next, Claire. For the first time in longer than I can remember, I feel ready to face it." As spring fully arrived, transforming the mountains surrounding Thornwood into a landscape of blooming color, Elena found herself standing at a crossroads unlike any she had faced before. The woman who had once measured her worth entirely by another person's choice had transformed into someone capable of choosing her own path forward, strong enough to build a future defined entirely by her own desires rather than obligations placed upon her by others. And as she watched Roderick move through the training grounds one bright spring morning, his storm-gray eyes finding hers across the courtyard with the same quiet warmth that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat, Elena understood with sudden clarity that whatever choice lay ahead of her, she would make it not as the broken woman who had fled through the forest all those months ago, but as someone entirely new. Someone finally, fully, becoming herself. The Council of Thornwood Elders gathered on a bright afternoon in early summer, their voices carrying through the great hall as they debated matters of trade and border security. Elena stood at the back of the chamber, no longer a stranger to these proceedings, having earned a place among the advisors consulted on matters concerning the kingdom's warriors and their training. It was during a pause in the discussions that an elder named Nathan raised a question that had clearly been circulating among the council for some time. "My king," he said, addressing Roderick directly, "the kingdom has noticed the closeness between yourself and the woman from Blackthorn. If this bond is to become permanent, the council believes it should be formalized, for the sake of clarity among our people and our allies." The chamber fell quiet, every eye turning first to Roderick, then to Elena, who felt her pulse quicken at the sudden attention. She had known, in the months since their conversation by the fire, that their relationship had deepened steadily, that the pack around them had come to expect an eventual announcement. But hearing the matter raised so directly, in front of the full council, still caught her off guard. Roderick did not appear surprised by the question, his expression calm and measured as he considered his response. "The council's concerns are valid," he said finally, "but this is not a decision I intend to make without Elena's full agreement. Whatever announcement comes, it will come, because we both choose it freely, not because tradition demands it." The elders exchanged glances, some nodding in approval, others clearly eager for a swifter resolution to the matter. But Roderick's words settled the discussion for the moment, and the council moved on to other business, leaving Elena with her thoughts spinning through the remainder of the meeting. That evening, Roderick found her on the northern balcony, watching the sun set behind the mountains that had become as familiar to her now as the landscape of her childhood home. He joined her at the railing, his presence settling something restless in her chest that had been stirring since the council meeting. "I'm sorry if that discussion made you uncomfortable," he said. "The elders mean well, but they sometimes forget that matters of the heart cannot be rushed simply because tradition expects certain timelines." "I wasn't uncomfortable," Elena said, and found the words entirely true as she spoke them. "I think I was simply surprised to hear our future discussed so openly, as though it were already decided by everyone except the two of us." Roderick turned to face her fully, something serious settling into his expression. "Then let us decide it together, tonight," he said. "Elena, I have watched you transform over this past year, from a woman broken by betrayal, into someone capable of standing beside any leader in these northern territories. I have watched your strength grow, your wisdom deepen, your heart remain open, despite everything that was taken from you. I do not offer this lightly, and I do not offer it out of obligation to the council's expectations." He reached for her hands, holding them steadily in his own. "I am asking you to become my queen, Elena. Not because tradition or politics demand it, but because I cannot imagine building this kingdom's future without you standing beside me. I want your strength paired with mine, your wisdom guiding decisions alongside my own, your heart bound to mine not through obligation, but through genuine choice." Elena's breath caught as the full weight of his words settled over her. She thought of the woman she had been on that terrible night in Blackthorn's great hall, humiliated and broken, believing her entire future had been destroyed in a single moment. She thought of every difficult day since then, every failure on the training grounds, every quiet evening of conversation that had slowly rebuilt something she believed had been lost forever. She thought of how far she had traveled, not simply in distance, but in the transformation of her own heart, from someone who measured her worth by another person's choice, to someone standing here now, being offered a crown not out of pity or political necessity, but out of genuine love, earned through months of shared struggle and growth. "Yes," Elena said, the word emerging with a certainty that surprised even her. "Yes, Roderick, I choose this. I choose you, and everything this future might hold." Roderick's expression broke into a genuine smile, one Elena had come to treasure over the months of their growing closeness, and he pulled her gently into an embrace that felt like coming home to a place she had never known existed until now. "Then we will announce it to the council tomorrow," he said softly, "and to the entire kingdom, so that everyone understands the choice was ours alone, made freely and without hesitation." The announcement the following day was met with genuine celebration throughout Thornwood territory. The pack that had watched Elena's transformation over the past year, from wounded outsider to respected warrior, welcomed the news with an enthusiasm that surprised her, gathering in the courtyard to offer their congratulations, as word spread quickly through every corner of the kingdom. Claire found her amid the celebrations, embracing her tightly. "I told you," she said, laughing through tears of genuine happiness. "I told you he had never looked at anyone the way he looks at you." Amelia, too, offered her congratulations, though characteristically practical in her delivery. "You'll need to continue your training regardless of your new title," she said, though warmth softened her usually stern expression. "A queen who can defend her own kingdom is worth twice as much as one who cannot." Elena laughed, feeling lighter than she had in longer than she could remember. "I wouldn't have it any other way," she said. As preparations began for a formal coronation ceremony, word of the announcement inevitably began to travel beyond Thornwood's borders, carried by the same trade routes that had first brought news of Elena's survival to Blackthorn months earlier. It would only be a matter of time before the news reached the kingdom she had left behind, before Damien learned that the woman he had rejected was now preparing to be crowned queen of his kingdom's greatest rival. Elena thought of this possibility only briefly, amid the whirlwind of preparations consuming her days, and found that the thought no longer carried the sharp sting it once might have. She had built something entirely her own here in Thornwood, something that owed nothing to the life she had left behind, and whatever reaction her old kingdom might have to the news, it no longer had the power to shake the foundation she had built beneath her own feet. She was no longer the woman who had fled through the forest, desperate and broken. She was becoming someone new entirely, someone who had chosen her own path forward, someone about to stand as queen, not through obligation or political necessity, but through a bond built on genuine respect and hard-won love. As the days of preparation continued, Elena found herself standing often at the northern balcony, where Roderick had first proposed their future together, watching the mountains that had become her home, feeling a peace settle over her that she had once believed impossible to reclaim. Whatever reaction awaited her from Blackthorn, whatever storm might yet be stirring in the kingdom she had left behind, Elena faced her future now, with a strength that no betrayal could easily shake again. She had built this new life through her own determination, her own growth, her own choices, and nothing that happened next would ever take that foundation away from her. The morning of the coronation arrived clear and bright, the kind of early summer day that seemed to have been chosen by fate itself to mark the beginning of something significant. Thornwood territory had transformed overnight, banners of deep green and silver hanging from every tower, flowers gathered from the mountain slopes, woven into arrangements throughout the great hall where the ceremony would take place. Elena stood in her private chambers as Claire helped her prepare, the same woman who had nursed her back to health nearly a year earlier, now carefully arranging the folds of a gown unlike anything Elena had worn before. Unlike the delicate white silk she had worn on the night of her humiliation in Blackthorn, this gown was crafted from deep forest green fabric, embroidered with silver thread that caught the light with every movement, a color chosen deliberately to reflect the kingdom she was about to formally join. "You look like you were always meant to wear this," Claire said softly, stepping back to admire her work. "Like Thornwood has been waiting for you all along." Elena studied her reflection in the polished mirror before her, hardly recognizing the woman staring back. Gone was the fragile, uncertain girl who had once measured her entire worth by whether a man chose to bond with her. In her place stood someone steady, someone strong, someone who had earned every inch of the confidence now visible in her posture and her gaze. "I feel like myself for the first time in years," Elena admitted. "Not the version of myself someone else expected me to become, just myself." A knock sounded at the door, and Amelia entered, dressed in her finest ceremonial armor rather than the simple training clothes Elena had grown accustomed to seeing her wear. "The hall is ready," she said. "The elders are gathered, the pack has assembled, and your king awaits you." She paused, a rare softness entering her usually stern expression. "You have earned this, Elena. Every warrior in this kingdom knows it." The walk toward the great hall felt both endless and impossibly brief, Elena's heart racing with anticipation as Claire and Amelia flanked her, guiding her through corridors lined with well-wishers who had gathered simply to catch a glimpse of the woman about to become their queen. She recognized faces from her months of training, from the battle at the eastern border, from countless shared meals and conversations that had slowly built the foundation of belonging she now felt so completely. When the doors of the great hall finally opened before her, Elena found herself facing a sight entirely different from the humiliating scene she had endured in Blackthorn a year earlier. Where that night had been filled with judgment and pity, this hall overflowed with genuine warmth, hundreds of faces turning toward her with expressions of respect and celebration rather than cold calculation. At the far end of the hall, standing before the ancient throne of Thornwood, Roderick waited for her, dressed in formal robes of deep green and silver that mirrored her own gown, his storm-gray eyes finding hers across the length of the chamber, with an intensity that steadied her nerves entirely. The elder who would oversee the ceremony, an aged wolf named Oliver, who had served 3 generations of Thornwood rulers, stood ready beside the throne, an ancient crown resting on a velvet cushion before him. Elena walked the length of the hall with measured, confident steps, no longer the frightened girl who had once fled through darkened forests, but a woman who had chosen this path with her whole heart, arriving at it through struggle and growth rather than obligation or desperation. When she reached the front of the hall, Roderick took her hand, his grip warm and steady, grounding her in the moment as the ceremony began. Elder Oliver's voice carried clearly through the silent hall as he spoke the ancient words of the coronation, words that spoke of duty and honor, of the responsibility carried by anyone who wore Thornwood's crown, of the sacred bond formed between a ruler and the people they were sworn to protect. Elena listened carefully, understanding the weight of each phrase, feeling the significance of the moment settle over her, with a gravity that matched the joy filling her chest. "Elena of Blackthorn," Elder Oliver said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall, "do you accept the crown of Thornwood, and with it, the sacred duty to protect and guide this kingdom, alongside your king, for as long as you shall rule?" "I accept," Elena said, her voice steady and clear, carrying none of the uncertainty that had once defined so much of her life. "With my whole heart, I accept." Elder Oliver lifted the crown from its velvet cushion, an intricate circlet of silver worked into patterns that echoed the ancient forests surrounding the kingdom, and placed it carefully upon Elena's head. The weight of it settled against her brow, lighter than she had expected, yet somehow carrying the full significance of everything it represented. "Rise," Elder Oliver said. "Queen Elena of Thornwood." The hall erupted in cheers, hundreds of voices rising together in celebration, and Elena felt tears gather in her eyes, though these tears carried none of the pain of the ones she had shed a year earlier in a very different hall. These were tears of genuine joy, of hard-won triumph, of a future finally arriving that she had built with her own strength and determination. Roderick turned to face her fully, his expression filled with a pride and affection that needed no words to convey its depth. "Queen Elena," he said softly, for her ears alone, amid the surrounding celebration, "you have earned every part of this crown, and everything it represents." "We earned it together," Elena said, her voice thick with emotion. "I could not have found this version of myself without you standing beside me through every step of the journey." The celebration that followed stretched long into the evening, the great hall filled with music and laughter, entirely different from the cold formality that had once defined the ceremonies she remembered from Blackthorn. Here, warriors she had trained alongside embraced her with genuine warmth. Elders who had once viewed her with cautious suspicion now offered their blessings with sincere respect. Even the youngest members of the pack approached her throughout the evening, eager to catch a glimpse of the new queen who had once arrived among them wounded and broken, now standing tall and radiant in her rightful place. Claire found her during a quiet moment amid the festivities, embracing her warmly. "Do you remember," Claire said, "that first morning when I brought you food and water, and you asked me where you were, terrified of what might happen next?" "I remember," Elena said, smiling at the memory despite the pain that had once accompanied it. "I thought my life had ended that night." "And now look at you," Claire said, gesturing toward the celebration surrounding them. "Queen of the very kingdom that once frightened your entire pack. I don't think anyone could have imagined this outcome, that first terrible night." "I certainly couldn't have," Elena admitted, "but I'm grateful for every difficult step that brought me here." As the celebration continued, Elena found herself standing briefly alone near one of the great hall's tall windows, looking out at the mountains bathed in moonlight, the same mountains she had first glimpsed from her recovery bed nearly a year earlier. She thought of the long journey that had brought her to this moment, the pain of betrayal that had first sent her fleeing into the forest, the terror of that night with the wandering wolves, the slow and difficult process of rebuilding herself into someone stronger than she had ever imagined possible. She thought too of Damien, and found that the thought no longer carried the sharp sting it once might have. Whatever he felt upon learning of her survival, whatever reaction he might have when word of her coronation eventually reached him, it no longer had the power to diminish what she had built here in Thornwood. She had transformed her deepest pain into her greatest strength, and nothing that happened next could take that transformation away from her. Roderick joined her at the window, his hand finding hers as they stood together looking out at the kingdom they would now rule side by side. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly. Elena considered the question seriously before answering. "None," she said, and found the word entirely true as she spoke it. "Every difficult moment led me here, to this exact place, standing beside the person I was always meant to find. I wouldn't change a single step of that journey, even the painful ones." "Not even the betrayal that started it all?" Roderick asked. Elena thought of that terrible night in Blackthorn's great hall, of the humiliation and heartbreak that had once felt like the end of everything she believed her life would become. "Even that," she said finally, "because without it, I never would have found my way here. Sometimes the worst moments of our lives become the beginning of something far better than anything we could have planned for ourselves." As the celebration continued into the night, word of Elena's coronation had already begun its journey along the trade routes that connected the northern territories, carried by merchants and travelers, who would soon spread the news through every corner of the region, including the kingdom she had left behind nearly a year earlier. It would only be a matter of days before Damien learned that the woman he had rejected, the woman he had believed lost forever in the depths of a dangerous forest, now sat upon the throne of his kingdom's oldest rival, crowned queen not through political necessity or desperate circumstance, but through a bond built on genuine love and hard-won mutual respect. And when that news finally reached him, it would shatter whatever careful balance he had managed to maintain since the night he had chosen ambition over the woman who had once given him her whole heart. The news reached Blackthorn on a quiet morning, delivered not through Edmund's careful inquiries this time, but through the open gossip of merchants who no longer bothered to keep the story contained, given how widely it had already spread throughout the northern territories. Damien heard it first, from a young guard stationed at the kingdom's main gate, who mentioned it in passing to another guard, unaware that their alpha king stood close enough to hear every word. "They say she wore a crown fit for any queen in the north," the guard said, clearly repeating something he had heard from a passing trader. "King Roderick himself placed it on her head, in front of his entire kingdom." Damien stopped walking, his entire body going rigid as the words settled over him. He turned toward the guards, his expression carefully controlled despite the storm building rapidly inside his chest. "What exactly are you discussing?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. The younger guard startled, clearly embarrassed to have been overheard by his king. "My apologies, Alpha," he said quickly. "We were only repeating what the trader said. About the coronation in Thornwood territory. The woman from Blackthorn, crowned queen, alongside King Roderick." Damien felt something crack inside his chest, a fracture that had been slowly forming since the day he first learned Elena had survived, now finally breaking open entirely. "When did this happen?" he demanded. "Several days ago, Alpha," the guard said. "The whole northern territories are speaking of it. They say the ceremony was unlike anything Thornwood has seen in generations." Damien said nothing further, turning away from the guards and walking back toward the pack house with steps far more controlled than the chaos raging inside him. Elena, his Elena, the woman he had once promised his entire future to, now sat crowned as queen of his kingdom's oldest and fiercest rival. The woman he had cast aside in front of his own pack, believing she would simply disappear into insignificance, had instead risen to a position of power and respect that eclipsed anything she might have achieved as his mate. The realization struck him with a force he had not anticipated, a bitter mixture of shame, jealousy, and a grief he had spent months trying to convince himself he no longer carried. He had told himself, repeatedly, that his feelings toward Elena were nothing more than lingering guilt over the way he had ended their bond. But standing there in the corridor of his own pack house, learning that she now ruled beside his greatest rival, he could no longer maintain that comfortable illusion. He found Serafina in their private quarters that evening, her expression already carrying the knowing coolness of someone who had heard the news through her own channels. "You've heard then," she said, not looking up from the papers she was reviewing. "I have," Damien admitted. "And how does it feel?" Serafina asked, finally meeting his gaze directly. "To learn that the woman you discarded now wears a crown you will never be able to offer her, standing beside a king whose kingdom has always been your greatest threat." Damien did not have an adequate answer for her, and his silence spoke as loudly as any confession might have. Serafina studied him for a long moment, something hardening in her expression that had not been fully present before. "I have been patient with your distraction these past months," she said. "I told myself it was simply guilt, something that would fade with time, as our own bond deepened. But I see now that I was wrong. This is not guilt, Damien. This is regret over a choice you cannot undo, and jealousy over what that choice cost you." "Serafina," Damien began, though he found he had no words that could adequately deny what she had spoken. "Don't," she said, holding up a hand to stop him. "I did not choose this bond for love, and I never expected love from you in return. Our arrangement was always meant to serve both our kingdom's interests. But I will not continue pretending that your heart has ever truly belonged to me, not when every conversation about that woman brings this exact expression to your face." The confrontation left Damien with little peace in the days that followed, his mind circling endlessly around the image of Elena standing crowned in Thornwood's great hall, a queen in her own right, no longer the girl who had once depended entirely on his choices to determine her future. He found himself unable to focus on the responsibilities of his kingdom, unable to sleep through nights filled with memories of everything he had thrown away. Edmund found him one evening, still awake long after the pack house had settled into quiet, staring at nothing in particular from the balcony of his study. "You cannot continue like this, Alpha," the old advisor said gently. The pack has noticed your distraction. Your decisions have grown inconsistent. Whatever storm is raging inside you needs resolution, before it costs you more than it already has. What resolution could there possibly be, Edmund? Damien asked, his voice carrying a rawness he rarely allowed himself to show. She is crowned Queen of Thornwood. She has built an entire life without me, a life that seems, by every account, far happier than anything I offered her. Then perhaps you need to see that for yourself, Edmund said carefully. Rather than torment yourself with rumors and second-hand accounts, request a meeting at the border. Confirm with your own eyes whether the life you imagine for her truly exists, or whether these merchant stories have grown taller in the telling. The suggestion planted itself firmly in Damien's mind, growing over the following days into a decision he could not shake loose. He told himself he needed closure, that seeing Elena's new life firsthand would finally allow him to release the guilt and regret that had consumed him for months. He told himself many reasons, though the truth beneath them all was simpler and more difficult to admit, even to himself. He needed to see her again. He needed to understand what he had truly lost, and whether any part of what they once shared might still exist beneath the crown she now wore. The formal request for a border meeting was sent through official channels, carried by messengers who understood the delicate nature of communication between two kingdoms with such a long and complicated history. Damien framed the request in careful diplomatic language, citing matters of trade and territorial boundaries that required discussion between the two kingdoms' leadership, though everyone who read the message understood the deeper motivation likely driving it. In Thornwood, the request arrived during a council meeting, and Roderick read it carefully before passing it to Elena, who sat beside him now not simply as his companion, but as an equal voice in matters concerning their kingdom's future. He wants a meeting, Elena said, studying the formal request with an expression that revealed little of the emotions stirring beneath her calm exterior. At the border, to discuss trade and territorial matters. Do you believe that is truly his purpose? Roderick asked, watching her carefully. Elena considered the question seriously, weighing the request against everything she knew of the man who had once broken her heart so completely. I believe trade concerns are simply the excuse, she said finally. I believe he wants to see, with his own eyes, whether the life I have built here is real. And how do you feel about that? Roderick asked. Elena met his gaze steadily, finding within herself a calm certainty that would have been impossible for the broken woman who had first fled through the forest all those months ago. I feel ready, she said. I am no longer the woman he humiliated in that hall. Whatever he hopes to find at that border meeting, he will discover instead a queen who no longer needs his approval or his love to know her own worth. Roderick studied her for a long moment, pride and something deeper settling into his storm-gray eyes. Then we will attend together, he said. As equals, ruling this kingdom side by side, let him see exactly what his choices cost him. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, at the neutral border territory that had long served as the meeting point between Blackthorn and Thornwood, during rare moments of necessary diplomacy. As preparations began, word of the upcoming confrontation spread quickly through both kingdoms, every pack member aware that this meeting carried far more significance than simple discussions of trade and territory. Elena spent the days leading up to the meeting in careful preparation, not simply of the political matters that would need to be addressed, but of her own heart, ensuring that whatever emotions arose when she faced Damien again would not shake the foundation she had worked so hard to build over the past year. She thought often of that terrible night in the Great Hall, of the humiliation and heartbreak that had once defined her entire understanding of her own worth. She thought of every difficult step since then, every failure and triumph on the training grounds, every quiet conversation that had slowly rebuilt her into someone stronger than she had ever imagined possible. Whatever Damien hoped to find when they met at that border, Elena intended to ensure he found instead a woman who had transformed her deepest pain into her greatest strength, a queen who owed him nothing, and who no longer needed anything from him to know exactly who she had become. The border meeting point had once been a simple clearing between two forests, marked only by an ancient stone that had stood as the dividing line between Blackthorn and Thornwood territories for generations. On the morning of the meeting, that clearing had transformed into something far more significant. Banners from both kingdoms raised on opposite sides, warriors from each territory standing in careful formation, the air thick with tension that everyone present could feel. Elena arrived at Roderick's side, dressed not in her coronation gown, but in practical clothing, befitting a queen prepared for any outcome, a simple circlet marking her position, rather than the elaborate crown reserved for formal ceremonies. She had insisted on this choice deliberately, wanting Damien to see her not as a fantasy of royal transformation, but as the genuine person she had become, strong and capable regardless of ceremonial dress. Across the clearing, the Blackthorn delegation approached, and Elena felt her heart quicken as she caught her first glimpse of Damien in over a year. He looked much the same as she remembered, tall and commanding, though something in his bearing seemed less certain than the confident Alpha King who had once stood before his entire pack and ended their bond without hesitation. Beside him walked Serafina, her expression carefully composed, though tension radiated from her posture, and Elena found herself studying the woman who had ultimately been chosen over her, feeling nothing of the bitterness she might have once expected from such a moment. Whatever pain that choice had once caused her had long since transformed into something entirely different, a strength that made old wounds feel distant and manageable. The two delegations met at the center of the clearing, and for a long moment, silence stretched between them, as Damien's gaze found Elena's, taking in every change that a year of transformation had brought to her appearance and her bearing. "Elena," he said finally, his voice carrying a rawness he could not entirely disguise, "you look different." "I am different," Elena said simply, meeting his gaze without flinching. "A great deal can change in a year, Damien." The formal discussions that followed addressed the trade and territorial matters that had been cited as the official purpose of the meeting, conducted with careful diplomatic precision by advisors from both kingdoms, while Damien and Elena stood at the edges of the conversation, their attention repeatedly drawn back to each other despite the business at hand. Roderick remained close beside Elena throughout, his presence a steady support that required no words to convey its significance. When the formal matters had finally been settled, Damien found a moment to approach Elena directly, his voice lowered enough that only she could hear his words clearly. "I need you to know," he said, "that I never intended for things to end the way they did. I made a mistake that night, one I have regretted every day since." Elena studied him carefully, searching for the anger and hurt that once would have consumed her at hearing such words. She found instead only a calm clarity, the perspective earned through months of hard-won growth. "You didn't make a mistake, Damien," she said. "You made a choice, deliberately and with full understanding of what it would cost me. There is a difference." "I know that now," Damien said, something desperate entering his voice. "Elena, seeing you here, seeing what you've become, I understand now what I threw away. If there is any chance, any possibility that we could—" "There isn't," Elena said, cutting him off gently, but firmly. "Damien, the woman you rejected that night no longer exists. I am not who I was, and I would not trade the person I have become to return to a life built on your convenience, rather than genuine love." "Elena," Damien said, his voice cracking slightly. "You still what?" Elena asked, though her voice carried no cruelty, only a steady, unshakable truth. "You still feel guilt over what you did, I believe that. But guilt is not love, Damien, and even if it were, it would be far too late to matter now. I found something with Roderick that you and I never had, not truly. I found a love built on genuine respect, on patience, on being seen fully, for exactly who I am, rather than who someone needed me to be for political convenience." Roderick stepped closer during this exchange, his presence unmistakable, a silent but powerful statement of exactly where Elena's loyalty and heart now belonged. Damien looked between them, understanding finally settling fully over his expression, the last fragile hope he had carried into this meeting, crumbling entirely. Behind him, Serafina had watched the exchange with an expression that had grown increasingly cold throughout the conversation, and when Damien finally turned back toward his own delegation, he found her regarding him with a finality that matched Elena's own. "I have heard enough," Serafina said quietly, though her voice carried clearly enough for those nearby to hear. "You have made your feelings abundantly clear, Damien, in front of both our kingdoms. I will not continue pretending our bond carries meaning. It clearly does not when your heart remains so obviously elsewhere." The words landed with the weight of a decision already made, and Damien understood, standing in that clearing surrounded by warriors from two rival kingdoms. that he had just witnessed the collapse of everything he had built in the past year, all in the span of a single confrontation he had believed might offer him some form of resolution or reconciliation. Instead, he had found only the confirmation of everything he had feared. Elena was gone, transformed into someone stronger and more complete than he had ever helped her become, standing now beside a man who had given her everything Damien himself had failed to offer. And the alliance he had sacrificed her for, the bond he had chosen over genuine love, had just crumbled in front of witnesses from both kingdoms. Elena watched the exchange between Damien and Serafina with a strange, distant sense of closure, understanding that whatever consequences followed from this moment were no longer hers to carry. She had spoken her truth honestly and completely, and the outcome that followed belonged entirely to the choices Damien himself had made, both on that terrible night a year ago and in this clearing today. "We should return to Thornwood," Roderick said quietly, his hand finding hers with a gentle steadiness that grounded her fully in the present moment. "There is nothing more that needs to be resolved here." Elena nodded, turning away from the clearing and the crumbling remnants of the life she had once believed would define her entire future. As they walked back toward their own territory, surrounded by warriors who had come to respect and honor her as their queen, Elena felt the last remaining weight of her old life finally lift completely from her shoulders. Behind her, the confrontation between Damien and Serafina continued to unravel, their voices carrying tension that would only grow in the days following this meeting. The careful political alliance that had once seemed so secure, now crumbling under the weight of truths too long avoided. But Elena did not look back. She walked forward, toward the kingdom and the life she had built entirely through her own strength and determination, understanding fully for the first time that the story she was living now belonged completely to her, unburdened by the shadow of a past that no longer held any power over her future. The weeks following the border meeting brought significant change to both kingdoms, though the nature of that change could not have been more different between Blackthorn and Thornwood. In Blackthorn, the fragile alliance Damien had sacrificed everything to secure began unraveling entirely, as Serafina's family, learning of the public confrontation and her subsequent declaration, withdrew their support from the arrangement that had once bound the two kingdoms together. Serafina left Blackthorn territory within days of the border meeting, returning to her own family's kingdom with a clarity of purpose that left no room for reconciliation. The trade agreements and political alliances Damien had built his entire justification for rejecting Elena around collapsed alongside her departure, leaving him facing the uncomfortable truth that he had sacrificed genuine love for a political arrangement that had ultimately given him nothing lasting in return. The pack he ruled watched this collapse with a mixture of sympathy and quiet judgment, many remembering clearly the night Elena had been humiliated in their own great hall, understanding now that the consequences of that choice had finally arrived to claim their due. Edmund, ever loyal despite his advisor's clear-eyed honesty, remained by Damien's side through the difficult transition, offering counsel that Damien increasingly found himself unable to fully absorb. "You built your future on a foundation that was never solid," Edmund told him one evening, as they reviewed the damage the collapsed alliance had caused to Blackthorn's standing among the northern territories. "Elena offered you something real, Alpha, something built on years of genuine connection. You traded that for a promise of political convenience, and now you understand the cost of that choice more fully than words alone could ever teach you." Damien had no argument to offer against this truth, understanding fully now, in the quiet aftermath of everything he had lost, exactly what his ambition and pride had cost him. He would spend the following months rebuilding his kingdom's damaged alliances through more careful, more honest means, the lessons of his past choices finally reshaping how he approached his responsibilities as Alpha King. But the particular happiness he had once believed within his reach, the future he might have built with Elena had he chosen differently on that terrible night, remained forever beyond his grasp, a consequence he would carry for the rest of his rule. In Thornwood, the mood following the border meeting carried an entirely different energy, one of quiet triumph and settled peace rather than unraveling consequence. Elena returned to her kingdom with Roderick beside her, the confrontation with her past finally and completely resolved, leaving her free to focus fully on the future she had chosen, without any remaining shadow from the life she had left behind. The kingdom celebrated her return with genuine warmth, the pack having watched with quiet pride as their queen faced her former betrayer with a strength and dignity that reflected everything they had come to admire about her over the past year. Claire greeted her with a fierce embrace upon her arrival back at the pack house, while Amelia offered a rare, genuine smile of approval. "You handled that with more grace than most warriors handle actual combat," Amelia said, a note of real admiration in her usually practical tone. "I learned from the best teacher this kingdom had to offer," Elena said, embracing her friend and mentor with genuine gratitude. In the months that followed, Elena settled fully into her role as queen, her partnership with Roderick deepening steadily as they worked together to guide Thornwood through matters both large and small. She continued her training alongside the warriors who had first taught her to fight, maintaining the strength and skill she had worked so hard to build, while also taking on increasing responsibility for the kingdom's governance, her perspective and wisdom proving invaluable in council discussions that shaped Thornwood's future. She thought of Damien occasionally, though the thoughts carried none of the pain they once might have. She hoped, in a distant and uncomplicated way, that he would find some measure of peace in the life he continued to build in Blackthorn, understanding that whatever mistakes he had made, he remained a person capable of growth and change, just as she had proven capable of transformation herself. But her thoughts turned far more often toward the future unfolding before her in Thornwood, toward the kingdom she now called home, toward the man who had shown her, through patient kindness and genuine respect, exactly what real love could look like when built on mutual strength rather than convenient obligation. One evening, nearly 2 years after that terrible night in Blackthorn's great hall, Elena stood once again on the northern balcony, where Roderick had first proposed their shared future together, watching the sun set behind mountains that had become as familiar and beloved to her as any landscape from her childhood. Roderick joined her there, as he had grown accustomed to doing at the close of nearly every day, his presence a comfort she no longer took for granted. "Do you ever think about that night?" Roderick asked quietly. "The one that started this entire journey?" Elena considered the question, looking back over everything that had happened since that terrible humiliation, the pain and fear that had once defined her understanding of her own worth, the long and difficult path that had led her here, to this exact moment, standing as queen beside a man who had earned her love through genuine partnership rather than empty promises. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but when I think of it now, I don't feel the pain I once carried. I feel grateful, strange as that sounds. That night broke something in me, but it also gave me the chance to build something far stronger in its place." "I am grateful for it too," Roderick said, pulling her close against him as they watched the last light fade behind the distant peaks. "Though I wish it had not cost you so much pain to find your way here." "Every difficult step was worth it," Elena said, meaning the words completely. "Because it led me to this life, to this kingdom, to you. I would not trade this version of myself, this version of my future, for anything the old life might have offered instead." As the stars began to emerge over Thornwood territory, casting their familiar silver light over the kingdom Elena now called home, she felt the full weight of everything she had built settle into place around her, solid and unshakable. She had transformed her deepest betrayal into her greatest triumph, had turned a night of humiliation into the beginning of a life built entirely on her own strength and choices. She was no longer the broken girl who had fled through a dangerous forest, desperate and hopeless, believing her entire future had been destroyed. She was Queen Elena of Thornwood, a warrior, a leader, a woman who had discovered that sometimes the worst betrayals in life become the doorway to something far greater than anything that came before. And standing there beside the man who had shown her exactly what genuine love could look like, watching the mountains that had witnessed her entire transformation glow silver beneath the rising moon, Elena understood with complete certainty that she had finally found not just a crown, not just a kingdom, but the truest version of herself, standing exactly where she was always meant to be.